Thank you so very much. If you permit me to call you by your first names, thank you for your introduction, Petra, Brigitte, and Kate. My thanks, I must, if you permit me, also thank all the sponsors and organizers, especially the people behind the scenes that I may not name, the Department of Development Studies, the UNDP, the European Commission, and of course the Austrian Development Corporation and the Austrian Foundation for Development Research, which is where we are today. But my special thanks to Jan Jasinski, to Werner Raza, and especially Gabi Slezak. Thank you all. And then, of course, thank you all for being here. I really look forward to your questions and comments after the debate. It's, of course, my honor as well to be giving this lecture in the name of Richard Kapuscinski, journalist and writer extraordinaire, and I only hope that I can do justice to his work today. So, the ideology of celebrity humanitarianism. On the screen is an outline of my talk to give you a sense of the structure and the layout of my argument. But let me begin with a joke. It's a now famous Bono joke, actually, that was made famous by the late great comedian Robin Williams. And it goes something like this. So in the midst of a U2 concert, Bono approaches the mic and asks for complete silence. He then begins to clap. And he says, I want you all to think about something. Every time I clap, a poor African child is dying. Upon which someone in the crowd cries, well, stop bloody clapping then. So there you go, so the joke, of course, lies in the gap between the metaphoric meaning of Bono's performance and the literalness of the audience members' understanding of this joke. But what if, and this is me asking, what if, speaking metaphorically, the latter understanding really were true? That is, an African child is dying because Bono is clapping. That is, what if it's the performance of the celebrity's humanitarianism that is the show? What if staging this poor African child is a cover for the structural violence that has led to that child's death? And then if you push this logic to its end, all said and done, what if the clapping is actually applause for that child's death? Because otherwise no one would profit. So in this lecture, I want to take up many of these implied themes: celebrity self-promotion, diversion, propaganda, profiteering, alongside our own implication, alongside the audience's adulation and incredulity and criticism. And broadly speaking, what I want to argue is that celebrity humanitarian work legitimates late liberal capitalism and legitimates global inequality. And I want to draw on the work of Slavoj Žižek, the famous now Lacanian Marxist philosopher from Slovenia. And drawing on his work, I want to show, in fact, that this charity work is deeply tainted, is deeply ideological. So the concept of ideology has, in fact, all but been abandoned of late, especially since the fall of the Berlin Wall. But I would argue that it's Zizek almost single-handedly that has renewed interest in the question of ideology. For him, ideology critique is crucial at this time, precisely when the collapse of the Soviet experiment means that the global advance of capitalism and liberal democracy stands more or less unchallenged. Drawing on Jacques Lacan, on Lacanian psychoanalysis, he argues that there is a founding inconsistency or gap, what he calls the real, in our structures of signification, in our structures of meaning. So reality for him is forever ruptured by contradictions, by imperfections, and so the human condition cannot escape human perfection. Ideology, then, is that which attempts to obscure these imperfections, to cover up these gaps, to cover up these antagonisms and contradictions. So in this sense, the ideology is built into our environments. It is materialized and externalized. In a way, we build our world to escape trauma, to escape these imperfections and contradictions. And so ideology is externalized and materialized, if you like. That's okay. Now, for Zizek, and this is crucial to, of course, the rest of my argument, there are several non-rational elements upon which ideology depends, one of which is the Lacanian notion of jouissance, or enjoyment. Zizek makes the economy of human enjoyment central to his worldview, an emphasis that is now considered one of his key contributions to political theory. So drawing on Jacques Lacan, he takes jouissance to mean not just pleasure. Jouissance is not just pleasure. It's rather excessive or transgressive pleasure or pain. In fact, it's the pleasure we take in pain and the pain of pleasure, if you like, for the sake of which we might do things that seem irrational, that seem counterproductive, or even wrong. So there's an excess in jouissance that he's trying to get at. Zizek has in mind here the deep comfort and satisfaction that we get from, say, bureaucratic processes. We all hate bureaucracy, but when you think about it, there's something about the routines of bureaucracy and red tape that is somewhat satisfying. That's the kind of thing he's trying to get at. The comfort we get from religious rituals or social customs, or the thrill that we get from feeling unique as an academic, as a celebrity, as an activist, as a student, or the enjoyment that is derived from those things that bind us as a nation, as a community. For example, as a community in the University of Vienna, the enjoyment we get out of identifying with that. So I'm going to come back to some of these themes as I move through the lecture. Let me go on to the question of celebrity humanitarianism. So celebrity humanitarianism has become de rigueur these days. Almost every day it seems that George Clooney is organizing a fundraiser, Steven Spielberg is making a pledge, Scarlett Johansson is going on a mission, Jay-Z is touring Africa, or American Idol is giving back. Charity work, in fact, has become so cliché, I would argue, that even Bruno, I hope you remember, Sacha Baron Cohen, sees it necessary to adopt an African baby to jumpstart his Hollywood career. I'm going to focus mostly, although not exclusively, on the humanitarian work of Bob Geldof, Bono, Angelina Jolie, and Madonna. There we go. And I'm going to really abbreviate this section because I'm assuming that most people are actually quite familiar with the work that they do, which of course itself is telling, I think, about the celebrity culture that we live in. So Geldof is treated as a political leader in his own right. He has organized, as we know, Band Aid and Live Aid in 1984-85 to raise funds for the Ethiopian famine at the time. And then Live 8 in 2005. The Live 8 events were a massive success in terms of garnering public support and media attention. But I would argue they were also largely a failure in terms of their primary aim of influencing G8 development programming and policy. Like Geldof, Bono has become a force to reckon with on the global anti-poverty movement in particular. He has, of course, educated himself on North-South issues and has not hesitated to surround himself with professionals. So he calls Jeffrey Sachs, the Columbia University economist and this ubiquitous development advisor to the stars, he calls him his mentor. For her part, Angelina Jolie contributes significant personal time and resources to her humanitarian causes, often portrays herself as a witness to disasters, conflicts, and other people's suffering. But it's perhaps also in her role as transnational, as mother and as transnational adoptions advocate, I like that image, that she is best known. So she has given several interviews advocating for transnational adoption. So much so, and I guess this is interesting, that following her adoption from Ethiopia in 2005, there was a reported increase in US adoptions of African children. Madonna's charity work mirrors Jolie's, although it has been probably less extensive and has focused mainly on Malawi. We are probably all aware, all too aware maybe, of her 2 adoptions, which I won't go into. But again, news outlets such as the Wall Street Journal have reported that, and I quote, international adoptions by Americans have been escalating with stars such as Madonna traveling abroad to adopt. So we live in an age in which entertainment stars play a very prominent role in global politics. And I do want to say that I'm really not interested in my research and in my talk in the personal motives or the idiosyncrasies of these celebrities. Rather, the question I'm asking is, what does the rise of celebrity culture say about our times? What does it say about the way we organize our politics, democracy? What does it say about our economies, about the market? Those are the kinds of questions I'm asking. So let me get to the ideological underpinnings of some of this. The first ideological critique is probably the best known one, the question of self-promotion. Despite being presented to us, or at least implied as a selfless and altruistic philanthropic act, celebrity humanitarianism is notably ideologically tainted. It is deeply invested in self-interest and promotion, and in this post-Fordist industrial age, particularly in the creation and marketing of the celebrity brand. Branding, of course, is an important phenomenon of our times. Stardom, after all, is manufactured, let's not forget, backed by a massive marketing machine that includes management and talent agencies, entertainment lawyers, and advertising and public relations firms, each often tied to larger corporate and media interests. The integration of celebrity philanthropy and branding has enabled the creation of a brand identity. Call it the humanitarian celebrity, for example, with widespread and instant recognition that sells not just a product, but also a lifestyle, a set of values and aspirations. So just like Nike is associated not merely with shoes, but with transcendence, Benetton, not just with clothing, but with multiculturalism, and Starbucks, not just with coffee, but with community, so stars such as Jolie and Bono are associated not just with entertainment, but with caring, with compassion, with generosity. And espousing humanitarian causes allows these celebrities to build their brand image in several ways. It can increase their profile by widening their media exposure and allowing them to remain in the public eye. So they remain in the public eye even though there's no CD or movie to sell. In some instances, philanthropic work can divert attention away from the more embarrassing or lurid elements of celebrities' lives. And so in the case of Madonna, for example, her serial marriages and affairs, her racy videos, her material girl reputation. The branding of celebrity humanitarianism, of course, also brings significant economic returns. Now, probably the most important example here is that of Live 8. This was billed, if you recall, as the greatest show ever, that's their logo, in support of global humanitarianism, and it was produced as a massive media event that sloganized and logoized debt and poverty. So Make Poverty History was, an important, significant advertising campaign, and it served as a marketing platform for several corporate sponsors. At that time, AOL, Time Warner, BBC, Nokia. It also provided supposedly unpaid artists with wide global exposure and subsequent rises in music sales. So here's a table. You probably won't be able to read it because it's written in very small writing. But for example, the HMV and Amazon album sales of Live 8 artists such as Pink Floyd, The Who, Annie Lennox, Sting and the Police, and Madonna all increased by between 150% and 3,600% in the week following the concert. That was Pink Floyd, 3,600% increase in sales. So by any measure then, This was indeed the greatest show ever, although not for poverty as much as for self-promotion, I would argue. Complementing the economic benefits are the symbolic returns of celebrity humanitarianism. So, talking about Live 8 in a Guardian interview, Bono declares, for example, and this is on the screen, "This is show business. Years ago, we were very conscious that in order to prevail on Africa, we would get better at dramatizing the situation so that we could make Africa less of a burden and more of an adventure." So he admits that drawing attention to Africa requires dramatization through show business as adventure. But what he shies away from is that such dramatization often ends up centering the star, that is him, not Africa. So when Jolie speaks about Africa, as she often has done, for example, on CNN, the story ends up being not about Africans as such, but mostly about her experience traveling there, her guilt, her sympathy. Perhaps more poignant here are the instances of celebrities hijacking humanitarian campaigns. So when the Glen Eagles G8 summit drew to a close, several NGOs criticized Geldof for misrepresenting the summit's accomplishment. Keen to make the Live 8 pressure on the G8 leaders look fruitful, he boasted to the press about mission accomplished, which, if you remember, of course, echoes George Bush's mission accomplished on that ship during the war, the war with Iraq and Afghanistan. So he declared that it was a great day for Africa, and he gave Tony Blair a 10 out of 10 for his leadership, and he gave G8 an 8 out of 10 on debt. But many NGO leaders who had worked hard on the Make Poverty History campaign were much more critical, with one spokesman declaring, and I quote, "Bob Geldof's comments after the G8 were very unhelpful because they made people think everything had been achieved, when in fact very little had been achieved." The unfortunate casualties here are, of course, the humanitarian causes being espoused by these celebrities, often resulting in drowning out dissenting voices instead of heeding them, simplification instead of considered examination, razzle-dazzle and spectacle instead of content. But if you think about it, maybe success is actually not the point at all. Failure may be fine, as long as the philanthropic effort comes off looking good. In the case of Band-Aid and Live Aid, for example, as Alex Duval, the academic, notes, the rush, and I quote him, "The rush was to be seen to deliver food. The public and politicians demanded visible action to salve their consciences. The pressure unleashed by Band-Aid debased the currency of humanitarianism. Advertising went up and quality went down," unquote. Although outwardly other-regarding, celebrity humanitarianism's first duty is to itself, as I have repeated now. But what is remarkable is that although this fact is in plain view, I mean, which of us doesn't know about the power and privilege of these celebrities, it is never fully revealed or spoken by the celebrity. And this attempt at covering up the embarrassing truth, at disavowing what I would call the dirty underside, at disavowing that, this is what is ideology, if I go back to that definition of ideology that I started with. So Jolie's book, notes from my travels, for example, it is, if you read it, it's a moving account of her experiences and impressions of the third world, but it makes almost no mention of her celebrity status, referring to herself, and I quote her, "just as an American who wants to learn about Africa, feeling, quote, stupid and arrogant to think that I know anything about these people and their struggles," unquote. Yet these attempts at anonymizing herself, this performance of the authentic and ordinary person, is none other than a ploy to ingratiate herself to her public, thus once again putting herself at the center of the story. And most often when celebrities do publicly disclose something about their social privilege, it's in the form of humor and irony. So Coldplay's Chris Martin, the former husband of Gwyneth Paltrow before they consciously uncoupled, if you remember that whole thing. He appears as himself in a charity advertisement on the British sitcom Extras. And he plays a stereotypical narcissistic celebrity. So he's joking with himself here. He'd rather promote his latest album than do the charity work. And he exclaims, "Can we get on with this? I've got AIDS and Alzheimer's and landmines this afternoon, and I want to get back to Deal or No Deal. Plus, Gwyneth's making drumsticks." So poking fun at both himself and the hypocrisy of celebrities appears progressive. Yet, as Zizek would point out, it is another case of what he calls fetishistic disavowal. That is, it allows celebrities to express a certain anxiety about their privilege or narcissism, but yet they still continue to do what they do, which is they continue to go about their business. So ironic distance provides an illusion of critique, but it leaves untouched the fundamental ideology, the fundamental fantasy of humanitarianism. So moving on to this question of promoting the Western nation. One of the distinguishing features of any nation is the way in which it organizes its enjoyment, its jouissance, through festivals, sports, holidays, myths, and the like. So celebrity philanthropy is a case in point here, since it allows Western nations to construct community, political community, around a heroic figure in the person of the humanitarian celebrity. So when Jolie and Madonna donate large sums of money to charities, when Geldof is repeatedly considered for the Nobel Peace Prize, or Bono is chosen as Time magazine's Person of the Year, the Western nation, in this case the US, Great Britain, or Ireland, feels and looks good. So celebrity humanitarianism is thus bound up with nationalism, with Occidentalist discourse, if you like, since it helps produce a generous and benevolent national community, building unity and pride. A notable feature of nationalist discourse is its preoccupation with gender, particularly the symbolic importance given to mothering and childbearing, something that Jolie and Madonna's humanitarianism aligns itself with. In fact, the philanthropic causes that they have espoused appears stereotypically gendered, I would argue, equating femininity to motherly caring and transnational adoption. This gendered humanitarianism mirrors idealized nationalist and I would say Christianized notion of womanhood, wherein mothers are entrusted with ensuring the stability of the home and of the nation, with the preservation and reproduction of family and kinship, for example. Indeed, in the US, during and after the Cold War, in the US, to adopt a child was to serve the nation and its national security and foreign policy priorities, especially in the aftermath of the Korean and Vietnam Wars. So Madonna and Jolie may then be said to be continuing this US national tradition. Their transnational adoptions aid the nation by encouraging others to adopt, while also constructing themselves and other adoptive parents as saviors of orphan third world children. So to echo Gayatri Spivak, the academic, it's another case of white women saving colored babies from colored men and women, in the service of the nation this time. In order to rationalize adoption, the child adoptee is typically portrayed as an innocent victim of a crisis: war, displacement, starvation, infanticide, dependent and helpless. Hence the need for its rescue. So the one construction, the victim, rationalizes the rescue. Not surprisingly, investing the child with such rescue fantasies and feelings of redemption ends up centering, once again, the adoptive Western parent as responsible guide and savior, especially, of course, in opposition to the so-called absent and irresponsible third world parent, while once again instrumentalizing the child. But in addition to being a symbolic support, Madonna and Jolie are also a material support to the nation. Their example as transnational adoptive parents helps address critical bottlenecks in Western country demographics and labor markets. So declining birth rates, rising labor requirements of our ever-expanding economies, all of these translate into the need for more immigration and adoption. Not surprisingly, Western governments have been quick to encourage international adoptions, many of them providing tax incentives. So in the US and Canada, for example, adoptive parents can claim up to $10,000 in tax credits. Far from yielding a multicultural family, like in the tradition of Madonna and Jolie Pitt, transnational adoptions, let's not forget, is also very gendered. Most adoptees tend to be girls, and highly racialized. In the US, for example, the first main wave of adoptions was Asian children in the aftermath of the Korean and Vietnam Wars. But after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, there was a significant rise in adoptions from countries such as Romania and Russia, with a corresponding decline in adoptions from Asia. So as one commentator says, quote, as soon as white children were available, prospective international adopters opted for race over all other considerations. So celebrity humanitarianism, I would argue, transnational adoption in this case, is nothing short of neo-colonial. When privileged white Western parents deracinate third world children, deprive a country of significant social potential, select the most desirable children, often on the basis of race, health, and ability, all the while failing to address the root causes of orphanages, which I would argue is really about inequality, we have then relations of domination and dependency. By the way, I do want to mention that I actually prefer the word third world. I know it has a derogatory meaning. Most people, these days use the politically correct term global south, which is marginally not as good as far as I'm concerned. All these terms are problematic. This is part of development discourse, I think. I prefer third world because of its historical origins in questions of non-alignment. But of course, this is a big debate. Promoting capitalism. So celebrities are already tied to the corporate world through their professional work, earning some of the highest incomes globally. They also profit tremendously from their brand image, a point that I underlined earlier. It's these exclusive intellectual property rights that enable celebrities to take advantage of corporate product endorsements, lending their name and image to a corporate brand for a fee that can amount to several $1 million. So here's another table that you probably won't be able to read once again, but it illustrates the extent of such endorsements, focusing particularly on humanitarian celebrities from Bono to Jolie, Madonna, and Geldof. Of course, some humanitarian celebrities are entrepreneurs in their own right. So Bono, for example, owns a luxury hotel and is the managing director and co-founder of Elevation Partners, which is a private equity firm with about $2 million of capital invested in intellectual property and media, which, and by the way, they partly own the conservative business magazine Forbes. Significantly, humanitarian celebrities bring their business acumen and experience to their charity causes. So already in 1985, when organizing Live Aid, Geldof saw himself more as an entrepreneur and fundraiser than an entertainer. He is even reported to have declared, I quote, "The more multi-million record-selling acts, the better." Describing his own and Geldof's role in Live Aid a decade later, Bono affirms, "We're," and I quote him, "we're adventure capitalists." And in a New York Times article entitled "Citizen Bono Brings Africa to Idle Rich," which is there on the screen, he goes further, advertising Africa as business opportunity almost in the manner of an agent of capital. So he says, one of the things I have learned of in Africa is the crucial role that commerce will play in taking its people out of extreme poverty. Everyone talks about China being the next big thing, but if you spend any time in bars or hotels in Africa, you see a lot of Chinese doing deals there. There's a tremendous opportunity there. Africa is sexy, and people need to know that. So therefore, not only are humanitarian celebrities deeply immersed in capitalism, but their charity work is entangled with it and even promotes it. Yet what they fail to realize or admit is that it's this very capitalism that is often the root cause of the inequality they are trying to address. Now, I don't have time to go into it, but many people have written about that capitalism is indeed a very efficient engine at producing wealth. But alongside this wealth, it also is terrible at redistributing this wealth, and hence it produces tremendous inequality and unevenness within countries and globally. In its latest neoliberal phase, from the 1980s onwards or so, supported by market and trade liberalization regimes, capitalism's unquenchable thirst for surplus value and new markets has meant the super exploitation of labor reserves. So sweatshops, primarily in fact composed of migrants and women, and the exclusion of social groups from accessing socioeconomic and environmental resources, particularly in the third world. So several of the multinational corporate firms that humanitarian celebrities are associated with, Coke, Nestle, and so forth, have contributed directly to social marginalization and exploitation. What is interesting is that, is that almost never do celebrities challenge capital. Hence this idea of I love inequality. At most, Bono and Geldof will criticize third world debt, but they always refrain from criticizing the IMF and the World Bank or other banking capital that underwrites this debt. Ostensibly, this is because they are leery of alienating their audiences, but mostly, I would argue, it's because they have little incentive in confronting the corporate power that they so profit from. Yet it is this depoliticization of capital, not speaking about capital, that causes its presence to be unspoken and invisible. Now, enjoyment, jouissance, to come back to that, has much to do with why capital is left unspoken. Humanitarianism, after all, is the gift that keeps on giving back, blinding all of us, by the way, to capital's production of inequality. Or, and here I'm going to be very cheeky, perhaps humanitarian celebrities are not quite so blinded. Given this pleasure-pain dimension that I talked about in jouissance, perhaps they are sadists, masochist sadists. And by the way, not just them, us too, yes? We are all part of this ideological discourse, as I'll get into later. Secretly enjoying not just the excessive pleasures of capital, but also the pain and the degradation that capitalism inflicts on the other. Despite public expressions of guilt, perhaps they derive obscene satisfaction and fascination from the global system of inequality, which places them as the dominant. And it's not just them. We all derive a certain masochistic pleasure. So, for example, when the neighbor that we don't like stumbles on his or her lawn, right? And we laugh, and we take a certain pleasure in that. But we can never speak about it publicly, of course. Yet such an indiscretion must remain publicly unacknowledged and unutterable. And in regard to celebrity humanitarians, I cannot help but wonder about their outwardly compassionate yet voyeuristic and sadistic gaze on the third world, the eagerness with which they will go on missions to witness the plight of refugees or the suffering of HIV and AIDS patients, for example, all the while occupying the dominant position. And I mean that in several senses of that term. Or the lengths that their fundraising activities will take in dramatizing the victimhood of, say, famine casualties in the form of emaciated bodies and swollen heads. There is something decidedly sadistic in these various excesses. promoting the post-democratic order. So the rise of humanitarian celebrities is emblematic of what philosophers Zizek and Jacques Rancière, the French political philosopher, have termed a post-political or a post-democratic order. These terms describe our current capitalist liberal democratic landscape where democracy is reduced to periodic elections and people, us, choose between mostly politically indistinguishable parties, platforms, and leaders. The post-democratic state is a managerialist state. Technocrats, expert policymakers, so expert polling specialists, expert economists, expert scientists, and corporate oligarchs interpret people's demands and translate them into practical policy decisions. In development, we're well aware of this whole idea of good governance, right? And consensus. These are the things that replace politics through the use of expert analysis and enlightened policymaking. So politics in this state of affairs is really a lack of politics, I would argue, with disagreement and dissent foreclosed. Humanitarian celebrities strengthen and fit well into this post-democratic order. Advised by managerial experts such as economist Jeffrey Sachs, they have become, as I emphasized earlier, the pundits of global altruism and a go-to on global policy questions ranging from debt and HIV/AIDS to adoption and famine. They command exclusive access to the global corridors of power and the ability to influence G8 leaders, US congressional representatives, captains of industry, or senior policymakers from the World Bank or the IMF. The legitimation of celebrities as policymakers can be seen, and this is an interesting example, in the Sharon Stone incident at the Davos World Economic Forum in 2005. So at the Davos Forum in 2005, a session sponsored by the UN, in fact, the Tanzanian president at the time expressed the need for more mosquito nets because of the breakout of malaria in his country. And so Sharon Stone rose at the forum and immediately pledged $10,000 to be able to buy these malaria nets, these mosquito nets. And she challenged all the leaders, the political and business leaders there to do the same. And in a short amount of time, about $1 million was raised. So now she probably did this out of the goodness of her heart. But the problem, of course, is that these were monies pledged, but not actually met, not actually given, which meant then that the United Nations had to replace the gap, had to make up for the gap. So, this is not again about Sharon Stone, but what I'm questioning is what is the type of entitlement that we have given to celebrities that they can do such a thing? And we are implicated in that. So as a result, several observers question Stone and other celebrities' legitimacy and credibility as policymakers, asking how they can determine what the likes of the UN should be spending its limited resources. As Haig et al. Argue, and I quote, "The logic of celebrity humanitarianism echoes post-democracy in that despite the rhetoric of populism, it is elite-focused. The emphasis ultimately is not on mass public action, but on elite action." There's Sharon Stone. Okay, so I've already underlined how celebrities act as direct or indirect agents of capital, but such economic imperialism is complemented and supported by cultural imperialism, I would argue, with the third world being used by celebrities as both cultural backdrop and dumping ground. Africa, in particular, is constructed as desperately in need. With the celebrity as the audience's guide, this so-called dark continent becomes a museum or a tourist attraction. Sometimes this instrumentalization is plainly very crass. So, for example, Madonna has used images of AIDS-stricken African children as a backdrop to her concert performances. And commenting on this practice, the New York Times says, and I quote, "Madonna has always known how to spot a trend, and much as it may strain the limits of good taste to say it, Africa, rife with disease, famine, poverty, and civil war, is suddenly hot." If the third world serves as background, it also acts as dumping ground for a range of first world fantasies. There are, of course, those rescue fantasies that I talked about earlier, but there's also the tendency to romanticize the third world. So in his 2005 BBC TV series on Africa, Geldof pronounces the continent to be, and I quote, quite simply the most extraordinary, beautiful, and luminous place on our planet, and depicts Africans as having a, quote, captivating grace of elegance and gesture. Yet, these are outwardly sympathetic. These are also romanticized and aestheticized fantasies about the other. And I think they mask what I would call a colonial gaze. They aim first and foremost at consolidating the self, that is Geldof himself, by ingratiating himself to the audience and rationalizing his charity work. But they also do the opposite. They also manage the other, the Africa in this case, by exoticizing it and, where necessary, passing judgment on it to put it in its place. So having just pronounced Africa as a luminous place, Geldof feels entitled to proffer a slew of Orientalist characterizations. He says such things as, conflict bedevils Africa, or Kinshasa is the capital of chaos. Zizek called such posturing a thinly disguised racism that parades as multiculturalism. Privileged, deracinated Westerners declare their respect for other cultures, yet maintain a certain distance by proclaiming them to be strange and exotic places. And so in this process, the third world is rendered silent. Even charity advertising campaigns, presumably advocating for third world marginalized people, can easily fall prey to such Orientalist and disempowering tactics. This is the famous case of the Harper's Bazaar issue, which had an ad for Keep a Child Alive, an NGO devoted to helping HIV/AIDS affected children and families, and it has Gwyneth Paltrow dressed up with face paint and an African-style bead necklace declaring, "I am African." The campaign recalls the minstrel blackface phenomenon in 19th century US and Britain with all its racist dimensions. And it prompts a Guardian columnist to ask, I quote, "What does it say about race today when a newspaper decides that its readers will only relate to Africa through a blacked-up white model rather than a real-life black woman?" Why isn't there an African woman there speaking? So celebrity humanitarianism constructs the third world, and Africa in particular, as voiceless and invisible. Because Africans are shown to be passive, and by the way, that's not to say that Africans actually are passive. Of course they're not. They're agents like we all are. But they're constructed as passive. The stars can ventriloquize and paternalize them. The ideological resort to these stereotypes about Africans being simple, noble, tribal, incompetent, politically naive, corrupt. All of this aims at fixing and naturalizing them, diverting attention away from the real nexus of the problem, which I would argue once again is questions of inequality and domination. And the employment of the term Africa attempts to elide or homogenize the whole continent, its complexities and differences, in order to contain it, to make it manageable. Now, of course, I too am using the word Africa, mea culpa, but at least, at the very least, I am pointing out the problems with this with the homogenization of the term. So let me conclude then with the question of our complicity in this. This is not a self-righteous argument that I'm making. We are part of the problem, as public, as academics, as students. I want to conclude then by emphasizing this point. Part of the problem is that as audience members, as fans, as consumers, say, of celebrity-endorsed products, we are all complicit in this ideological nexus. We support and maintain the celebrity fantasy of humanitarianism through our beliefs. We believe through, I think this is the interesting idea here, because I take it from Zizek. We believe through the star. That is, we delegate our beliefs in political change or charity to the celebrity. So Zizek illustrates this phenomenon by way of several examples, of which here is one. And I quote him, "In so-called primitive societies, we find the phenomenon in the form of weepers, women hired to cry instead of us. So through the medium of the other, we accomplish our duty of mourning, while we can spend our time on more profitable exploits, disputing the division of the inheritance of the deceased, for example. That's the usual Zizek humor. So like the weepers, humanitarian celebrities become stand-ins for our feelings of beneficence and compassion for the third world. Zizek calls this interpassivity, wherein not only do others believe for us, but through the transference, we no longer need to believe. The stars incarnate our urge for humanitarianism, and by delegating such work to them, we are relieved of doing charity work. Instead, we can go about our busy daily lives and grind without overly concerning ourselves with inequalities or famine. So now some of us may be ardent fans and admirers, enjoying the stars' entertainment and glamour and believing indiscriminately and sometimes blindly in what they represent and do. But of course, we may also be critics, cynical and suspicious, tired perhaps of the celebrities' overexposure in our celebrity culture, self-promotion or narcissism. Although note, for example, that at least some years ago, there was a Facebook webpage devoted to making Bono history. Yet Zizek reminds us that such reluctance need not be antithetical to ideology and may in fact be part and parcel of its operations. So I may actually enjoy my status as cynic or critic, feeling unique and privileged as a consequence. Ideology then thrives on providing us with a sense of distance, that we're not totally brainwashed. But the crucial point is this: though appearing to maintain a distance secretly, we may still enjoy watching celebrity shows and charitainment. Ultimately then, humanitarian celebrities carried the day. It's once again a case of fetishistic disavowal that allows for ironic distance but leaves untouched the ideology itself. So all said and done, we can go about our daily lives feeling consoled that, despite everything, at least someone is doing something about poverty or starving children. Yet when we don't have to think or do because the other thinks or does or acts for us, we have basically acquiesced to the capitalist and post-democratic order. We partake in empty rituals and allow these hired weepers to believe for us, to cry in our place, to maintain or change the world according to designs that are not our own. And transferring social and political activity to others, even reluctantly, may well allow us to escape a certain measure of trauma, but it's a highly depoliticizing move, I argue, that not only strengthens ideology, but makes us into passive spectators. Thank you.